So the glitch and blur effects aren't necessarily like reaching a certain end. So this isn't like solving a math problem where we all end up at the same point. This is really kind of highlighting some different techniques you can play with. And so I've got a little example of that. And this file, along with the text, is available in your download. So if you haven't downloaded yet, go ahead and download that. So we're going to play with this kind of funky, I call it a glitch effect. Just looking at different ways where we can use the effects. Then we're also going to play with a blur effect. And it's not learning these exact steps, although feel free to take notes while I demo and write down what I did, but it's about showing you some different techniques and things you can play with. So we're going to be looking at how to layer in different effects, exploring a couple of specific filters, and showing you how you can start accessing filters for different creative techniques. So this is really that composting photos that you guys were super interested in. Look at different ways to add texture. One of my favorite techniques, and that's how you get this kind of red-green technique, is editing channels. So we're going to play with that. Look at some masking and play with layer modes. So all of the practice files are in our download practice files. So go ahead and play with those during our practice time, but I will go ahead and get started with the demo. So we'll hop over to Photoshop. All right, so inside of Photoshop, I did give you this TIFF that has a text layer, and then it has a background layer. And so in case you didn't know who this gentleman, this dapper fellow is, this is William Allen White, the namesake of the journalism school. And just to give you a little background to William Allen White, he was a feisty fella. And I was looking through different quotes of his because I thought it'd be fun to use his photo. And he was, for his time, very forward thinking. So we'll get started with his photo. So a couple things about this photo. Notice that my color mode is actually RGB. So it has the appearance of a black and white photo, but it's actually in an RGB color mode. And the way you can check your color mode is just by going to Image, Mode, and Color, and then you can change that. And this gives us those channels that I mentioned we're going to be editing in. So to get us started, I'm just going to hide our text briefly so that it's not distracting us. And I'm going to copy this background layer. So one of the things you want to do whenever you're doing composites or layering in effects is kind of keep a background layer as sacred pixels, pixels that you aren't going to touch. So to copy this layer or jump it, I'm just going to hit Command J, and that's going to create a background copy. It's on this copy that I'm going to start our work. So I'm just going to hide that background layer. And then I'm going to turn this background copy into a smart object. So I'll Control click, convert it to a smart object. If you remember our previous lessons, this allows us to have non-destructive edits as we move forward. Today, we're really going to be working with our filter menus, and there are a ton of them. So I encourage you to kind of explore things at your own pace. Try to break stuff as much as possible. We're going to kind of live in a couple of different areas for today. We're going to hang out a lot in the distort and the blur, but I just want to point out all the different types of effects that you have here. And you can use this as a creation tool, as an artistic tool, all kinds of things. There's also a filter gallery that you can go into, and that allows you to see all of the different types of filters. And we'll be getting into this a little bit later, actually, as you can see, as we apply our halftone pattern. So I'll cancel that. And we're going to start out with the distort filters. So the distort filters literally edit the pixels that you have. So you can see this one pinches, and we can change the effect, and you can see how it's kind of pinching that content, and you get that preview right there. Polar coordinates allows us to create that spin type of look. If you've ever seen those little world looks, that's part of how you create those. Ripple, and again, you can increase the amount and you can increase the size. So one of the things you want to do as you play with this is look at how different options within each filter gives you different looks. I'm going to skip shear. That's actually the one we're going to apply, but I just want to give you a preview of some of these. So spherize, you can see that's popping that part out, and you can change how you're going to make that sphere happen. Spherize isn't a kind filter for a rotund gentleman as Mr. White is. Twirl, give you kind of this interesting shape here. And again, you can change how that's twirling, how much that's twirling. Twirl is actually an interesting one that I like to use just as a background effect. So taking some textures or taking a pretty neutral photo and twirling it. Wave. So we're actually going to probably add a wave in later. So I'm going to hold off on this one, but just notice all the different types you can do here. And that's the one we're actually going to play with, is that square one. And then finally zigzag. So one of the cool things about these filters is that you can layer different ones in. And so we're going to add that shear in. And so what the shear is going to do is kind of create a curve. So we're just kind of manipulating these different points. And so we can just decide, and you can see how we're bending this. And what we want is kind of like a combination of the ripples and waves. And I'm not going too extreme on this. I'm being kind of gentle with it because I just want a really kind of a subtle effect on this. So I'm going to hit OK. And so that's what we've created, is just this kind of curve. And this is going to be part of creating that glitch. Notice, because we used a smart object, we've added what are called smart filters. So I can just double click into that shear and continue to edit it. Now I'm going to, on this background copy, I am going to control click and go to my layer style. And my layer style is going to, actually, just double click, excuse me. Double click, go into my layer style, and I'm going to experiment here inside my blending options with my channels. So you can see, as I turn off different channels, I get different looks. So I can kind of decide what combinations of colors and things that I kind of like with that. And so I'm kind of liking that bluish look. So I've turned off my red channel and hit OK. So basically, with RGB, you have 3 color channels, and all of those overlay to get the pixels you have. So you notice when I turned off all of them, the photo actually disappeared. All right, so I'm going to copy this again. So I've got the same filters I'm copying up, but we're going to add some things to it and kind of blend these. So I'm going to hop back into my shear here, and I'm going to move this in another way. Hit OK. I'm going to go back to my layer style, and this time I'm going to add that green channel in. So you can see how I've created, there's the bottom copy, and then here's the top copy. So I'm kind of glitching where he is. I can do that a third time if I want to. Again, playing with where these are located. And I'm just going to extend these, and notice how I'm always going into the opposite. And this time we're going to have the red channel on. So you can see we've now created this kind of glitch effect into it. But I don't need to stop there. I can continue to add to this. So let's say I'm going to experiment with his eyes. And so I want to do this on my green channel. So I think it is this right here. So I'm going to select his eyes. I'm just going to use my selection tool. I'm going to kind of do a larger selection. And I can hold my space bar down as I select to kind of move this selection around. And when I'm done, just let go. So I'm going to add a filter just to that section. And let's add a little wave in there. See how that looks. So we're going to go in and I'm going to immediately switch this to square. So the square, and you can see what happens if you kind of randomize that. I want to have a low number of generators. And if you look at that preview, you can see kind of what the number of generators does to content. So I'm going to do, let's do 2. And these are like, you know, experiment with the look that you get. So I want a pretty high wavelength on this and a pretty high amplitude on this. So I'm going to hit OK. And so you can see, I don't know why that didn't, oh, because I didn't copy it. Let's do, this isn't a problem. So we are going to, actually, let's go back. I forgot to copy that selection. So we'll go back here. And so let's do our marquee. Okay, so I'm going to Command J that selection. And you can see when I Command J that selection, I've already started to get some interesting things happening. And then here's a cool trick. I can just add that same wave I had right to there. And you can see how now it's breaking up those pixels in different locations. I can repeat that by selecting different parts of this photo. So if I wanted to go here, and I'll Command J that, and I can apply that same wave, and just kind of stacking in these various waves and copies, I get some really interesting looks. And then I think it's always fun to go through and play and see with what layers you want. Which ones do you want to keep? Which ones do you want to change? And there's a certain amount of like, how am I selling this as I go forward? So I'm going to add our text back in. And so the text, since it's on top, it's completely immune. I do like that white color. This can be a good time to play with things like some of the shadow effects that you have down here. You notice this is the same thing we did before when we double clicked a layer and got to those options. It's the exact same thing. You can just reach them down at the bottom. I'm going to just leave that text plain though. And we're going to look at how you can add some texture to images, which I think is interesting as well. So I'm going to add a blank new layer, and I can do that with my new layer button just to the left of my trash can. And I'm going to fill this. So I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, and I'm going to choose to fill this with white. This basically means my texture is going to become a layer. And I do, again, want to turn this into a smart object. So everything I'm working with are those smart object layers. And we're going to go into that filter gallery. And we're going to apply this halftone pattern. So halftone patterns live under the sketch effect. And this is pretty, it's kind of uninteresting right now because I'm applying it to a white layer. But when I bring it onto the photo, you're going to see the effect. So I'm going to increase my size, decrease the contrast. I like the dot, but you can play with like, what would circles look like? That's really kind of, let's play with that. For some reason that seems nice to me today. And so I'm going to hit OK. And so obviously, whew, it's a thing here, but now we're going to blend it. So we're going to go up to our layers mode and let's try soft light. And so soft light is kind of blending that in. Now the cool thing is I can decide if I don't like this and I want to go back to that halftone pattern, boom, back into my filter gallery, back to the dots, hit OK. And so now I have this look, which I think does go a little bit better with what we have. In addition to playing with my layer modes, I can also experiment with the opacity. So I can drop this down and just kind of have it fade into the background. I can also move where this layer is, and that's going to give me a different look. So as I move that, you can see how that's playing around in there. So that is a look at how you can create that glitch effect. You can use these same things in combination. So really what I wanted you to look at is how can you apply filters, layer them in, work with the channels for an effect. Any questions about this technique? Okay, let's go on to our blur image. So the same thing, we're going to start by jumping our layer, Command J. This is going to become a smart object. So now we're ready to safely edit with this. So with this one, we're going to look at our blur features. And there's an entire blur gallery you can play with in here. We're going to stay with our traditional blurs. So one of the ones I wanted to show you was the Gaussian blur. So this is just going to give a general fade. If you have ever accidentally shot something vertical that needed to be horizontal, this is how you can play with that to make it look a little bit better. So that's Gaussian blur. There's the radial blur. And so this is going to create an interesting spin, and you can change where that center is. So you get that kind of look. The motion blur, which allows you to decide where's that motion coming from. You can see create some cool effects. So motion blur is actually something, if I am doing kind of a composite and I just wanted to create a cool background, to me this is a pretty cool background. It looks like a watercolor painting when you do that. And we'll look at a surface blur. So again, this is just going to give you some different radiuses, and you can see this is kind of giving you a foggy type of look. And it's almost like putting a lens on top of your camera with that. So experiment with those different blurs. Those are just a couple of my favorites. We're actually going to do the radial. Now that might be an interesting choice because this is a motion photo, but what I'm going to do is use that radial then to blur back in some content. So that's the blur I want. So you can see I've almost like taken out all of the parts of this photo, and I'm going to focus right here on this guy. So I'm going to add a layer mask to my photo, and I'm basically going to brush away these changes. So I'm going to grab my brush, and just like before, I'm painting in black. So black is down here as my foreground color. And what I'm going to do is just carefully paint this main athlete back into the photo. And the way that I'm going to paint this in, you can already start to see it. It's going to look like he is popping out of the blur, which to me is a crazy cool effect. Now you do have to kind of pay attention to like that you're not adding in the wrong areas, and you can kind of see down here I need to tweak a little bit. So I'm just going to zoom in. I'm going to change my brush size, paint with white, Brush that back in. And so as a news photo, obviously I've kind of changed this, but as a kind of artistic photo, a sports action photo, I think we've done some interesting things with it. So it looks like he is popping out of that blur. And all we've done here is that. And so you can use this masking technique with any of those filters that you add, just like we use them with our adjustments panel to brush back color and those type of things. So any questions on that technique? Okay, I'm going to pause my recording. All right, so a little walkthrough. Same techniques we just did. So I added that wave, which is that one that creates, so I use that square option, and I dropped out my green channel to get that kind of interesting color overlay. And then I actually didn't do this hue saturation. I went up here and I masked the Jayhawk back in. Not only did I mask it back in, but then I transformed it so it would be a little bit larger in the space. And I have some tweaking I would probably go back to and polish on that. And then just to bring in kind of some variety, I added a hue saturation. So this goes back to our edits from week 1, but instead of editing with them, I'm doing something creative with them. So that is my experimentation using some of the techniques we did today, as well as some ones from weeks 1 and 2. So next, let's give you a look at, let's switch our shares here. Share a couple of resources with you. So if you are not aware of the brand.ku.edu center, a lot of the campus photos I get are from the downloads. You can get all kinds of really cool campus photos here under the photo collections, but also experiment with any of the kind of brand guidelines in here as well. So going forward, I encourage you just kind of combine photos, play with those techniques, experiment some more with text. There's a lot of things you can do with text under that effect menu. Looking at different combinations. Try to post one to Slack. I would love to see some in there, or share at the beginning of our next session. And watch for the recap video. That will be up later today. Next week is our last session, which just blows my mind. These 4 weeks have flown by. But we're going to look at not only combining photos, so we're going to play again with some different techniques like we've done these past few weeks, but then we're going to animate that. So it's kind of taking our designs up to the next level. So that's our plan for next week.